when it occurs in nature, all intelligence is collective intelligence. Any real physical intelligence system that you can think of is composed of, a bunch of subordinate intelligences that are in turn, and I mean, depending on how far you want to take the whole it from bit Wheeler thing, it goes all the way down to like quantum fields and atoms and all of that stuff.
A nice place to start might just be if you tell me a bit about your work at VERSESAI, because it's kind of using, to my understanding, active inference and theories in cognition to kind of help us think about and create AI. So that might be a cool place to first maybe introduce active inference and then think about how that relates to things like AI, and then we'll see where it goes.
Absolutely. That's a great place to start. So yeah, I'm Maxwell Ramstead. I'm the Senior Director of Research at VERSESAI. Verses is a cognitive computing company. And basically we're in the business of taking the explanatory principles that have been discovered in neuroscience and the sciences that study cognition broadly, and turning them into design principles for artificial intelligence systems. In particular, we're interested in the physics of information. This has also been called Bayesian mechanics. So the physics of probabilistic beliefs, and applying that to build AI systems that are genuinely able to take a perspective on the world, and engage in active inference. Right. So active inference being kind of online, real-time, perceptual inference and action selection. So yeah, my background is multidisciplinary, like you were saying, mainly philosophy and computational neuroscience. I work closely with Carl Friston, who is the originator of active inference and free energy principle and all those nice things. So yeah, we've been around for going on half a decade pretty soon at Verses, and yeah, we have a very active inference focused lab. Actually, we're coming out of our cocoon this year. And we'll be rolling out some benchmark work comparing active inference-based AI to more standard. It's a weird historical circumstance that we now think of like deep learning as just kind of state-of-the-art standard vanilla stuff. But yeah, we'll be benchmarking and hopefully showing genuine advantages to flip into the
yeah. It would be interesting if you could tell me a bit about the challenges and even the thought process of like thinking about why you could apply active inference and these theories of understanding cognition to AI, because yeah, as you say, we've been creating like things like large language models and these more like generic and these interesting models in their own right, but they're not things that in many ways are sort of directly analogous to how our own cognition works. So how's it been trying to think about AI in this light?
Well, I mean, you can think of active inference as like going full Bayes. So it's a fully Bayesian approach where we're basically using one objective function, the variational free energy, to optimize the full kind of stack of intelligence, right? So variational free energy, it sounds sometimes like a little bit esoteric. It's a quantity from information theory, and essentially it quantifies the divergence or the distance between the data that you expected under some model of how the data are produced, and the data that you actually get. So one of the interesting things about using variational free energy is the kind of backbone for your stack, as opposed to say reward, is that you can do the whole inference. You can do inference on several different timescales, which essentially covers all the different like forms of intelligence that you might encounter in real time. So there's perceptual inference or state estimation, right? Which is basically, I think I have a hypothesis. I think the world is in a certain configuration or state. If the world was in that configuration or state, then I would expect to get a certain pattern of data. And then I can use the divergence between pattern that I got and the pattern that I expected to refine my hypotheses, right? And you end up selecting the hypothesis that has the lowest free energy, which means like that generates data that's the most consistent with the data that I'm actually getting. But you can take that up a level, right? If you have like one layer of inference running at like the kind of state estimation level, then you can do inference about the parameters of the actual model, like the structure of the process that's generating your data. So you can learn things like the transition probabilities and the likelihood that maps your basically the states causing data to the data that is caused by those states. And so yeah, you get this nice kind of parameter learning. Again, it's the exact same objective function. You're just iterating it at a slower time scale. So in some sense, it's kind of making inferences about your own inferences. And then at the top layer, you can actually do wholesale model selection using this same, right? So there, it's not the value of parameters, but the actual like existence of parameters within the model and the way that they're hooked up to everything. So yeah, it gives you a nice principled kind of bottom-up approach to building a whole AI stack based on the same core techniques everywhere, which I think is pretty cool. Historically, the reason these methods haven't been deployed at scale is that Bayesian techniques are sometimes difficult to scale. I mean, there are a number of problems with scaling. For example, where do your priors come from? One of the things that we've been doing at Verses is breaking the Bayesian wall, so-called. So figuring out efficient techniques that allow you to deploy approximate Bayesian inference at scale without running into the usual intractability problems that you run into with Bayes. The problem with Bayesian reasoning is that at the end of the day, you need to renormalize everything to probability distributions, right? So your posterior is proportional to your likelihood times your prior, but you need to normalize in order to get probability distributions like that integrate to one and so on back from that. And often the denominator that you need to like normalize with is intractable. So yeah, we've developed a bunch of alternative techniques. They've existed in the literature. Variational Bayes is a way of getting around this. So you replace an intractable exact inference problem with a tractable optimization problem. And that's gotten us a big part of the way to our objective. So yeah, you'll be hearing a lot about these results over the coming year. But it's been very exciting to develop all this stuff.
It's helpful. I mean, one thing I want to say is that when you talk about having to think about active inferences occurring at many scales, right? So kind of a benefit of like applying that to AI is that in a way, obviously that is how the brain and how active inference is occurring within us, right? It's kind of easy to like say if you're reading a paper or hearing about active inference, like, oh yeah, we predict and then we receive, sensory data back and we update that. But that's occurring, at the, say top level of the cortex, but then like lower levels of the brain. I mean, even like individual cells must be kind of maybe having their own. It's going, from the lowest levels up to the highest levels and like in these iterative processes. And I suppose like any AI kind of might need to have that. I guess think about normal like attention models and things. They're also like, let's try and get more nuance here by like predicting not just one level, but like how accurate like intermediary stage is going to be. So yeah,
you're putting your finger on something very critical here, which is and I think this is from a global or general kind of design perspective, this is where we are most I wouldn't say like in conflict with, but we're most opposed to the kind of standard foundation model approach. So when it occurs in nature, all intelligence is collective intelligence. Any real physical intelligence system that you can think of is composed of a bunch of subordinate intelligences that are in turn, and I mean, depending on how far you want to take the whole it from bit Wheeler thing, it goes all the way down to like quantum fields and atoms and all of that stuff. So yeah, the way that nature has solved the problem of intelligent behavior is to offload intelligent behavior to communities of intelligent beings that are able to, at the ensemble level, solve problems. So even you as an individual are you emerge as an entity from the coordinated interactions of an unthinkable number of different agents that are competent in their own domain.
Yeah.
As my liver does its thing, right, and your pancreas does its thing, and your heart, and then the all of these specific kind of intelligences that are expert within their domain, right? My heart does the blood pumping, and my pancreas does the et cetera, et cetera. Something more emerges from that, and so that's the blueprint that we're using at Verses, and I think more generally within the active inference approach to really understand intelligence. So, like, we're not trying to build the monolith at Verses, right? We kind of think that there's a problem currently with the idea of kind of building a machine god that just like is one monolithic centralized system that just like encodes all of like that. That's just not. That's not how nature designs intelligences. And there are reasons to think that this is not like an efficient way to go. There's what we need for the future of AI is to go, I think, in the opposite direction, right? Like what ideally, and our kind of end goal. We outlined this in our white paper, which was recently published. So the paper is called "Designing Ecosystems of Intelligence from First Principles," and that's precisely what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to design ecosystems of intelligent agents, some of which are quote unquote artificial, and some of which are quote unquote natural, like us. But yeah, so I think if you think of AGI, artificial and general intelligence is often presented as the North Star of AI research. And this can mean a bunch of different things. Usually, in the more plausible sense, what people mean by AGI is something like a system that's able to perform at human level on a bunch of tasks, which I guess is fine as far as it goes. Like that's a laudable and reasonable engineering objective, right? But the concept of AGI is kind of incoherent when you stop and think about it for a few minutes. In particular, intelligence is not general. There's no such thing as general intelligence. Like all intelligence is tailored to a specific kind of situation and reflects, contextually appropriate, adequate behavior within that context, right? Even things that might seem general, like mathematical reasoning and logic, are still fairly narrow, applied forms of intelligence. Like there's no such thing as general intelligence. So there's a sense in which I think a lot of the industry is kind of chasing a myth here. There's no such thing as general intelligence. So forget artificial general intelligence. That's probably not what we want to be aiming at, especially if we want to have realistic and achievable objectives.
Would you say so? It's interesting because obviously us as human agents, we do have the ability to have, you could say, deploy intelligence across many different domains. But do you think it's just better to conceptualize that as not a kind of intelligence, or like as something sort of?
I mean, you can think about it as a kind of intelligence, but what I mean is like, so your pancreas, right, is an expert at secreting different kinds of things. That's a kind of intelligence, right? Like these are like living organ systems that are constantly monitoring your internal state, your internal milieu, and secreting appropriate things when appropriate. That's a form of intelligence. Like I as an organism, like as an agent, I'm not very good at secreting bile. right? Like
Right.
this is what I mean. Like you know, certainly abstract, reasoning and stuff is applicable in a bunch of different domains. But when you're thinking about like intelligence, there are various kinds of intelligence that are just not equivalent to, I think, like abstract logical reasoning, if that makes sense. Even this kind of, the IQ or whatever gets captured under the G factor or whatever. I mean, it's not completely general in that sense, right? Like it's a specific kind of expertise that is deployable in specific kinds of domains, like any other, competence. Yeah, and I think it's a bit misleading to think of that as like general intelligence when it's a highly specialized form of mainly symbolic kind of reasoning, right? Like it's not as general as all that, really.
Given that
Give me the argument, at least.
Well, that's interesting because in reformulating intelligence in this way, this white paper you guys wrote on sort of ecologies of different agents and intelligences, how does that fit in? So, when you're building, AI that are based more on the kinds of active inference that we as human agents might do, and perhaps I'm just, you can tell me, are they maybe more interpretable and less, we can kind of see in what ways they relate to us. I'm just wondering then,
those
how
are
should
all
we?
boxes to check.
Okay.
So okay, active inference based AI architectures are constructed to be human interpretable or transparent. That's a big difference, right? So in our stack, we don't use any black boxes. We use, it's a similar kind of model architecture, right? But every parameter, every node that we deploy is explicitly labeled and corresponds to some aspect of the underlying situation that we're trying to model. So, our approach to, deploying AI in a given situation would not be to create this monolith that in theory has information about every context whatsoever. It's to deploy agents that are expert within a specific, situation or domain of expertise, right? And then, to create an ecosystem of such agents that are able to, deploy in real time. These are lightweight agents, so to speak, right? Like you're not talking about agents with like 10 trillion parameters. I mean, just taking one step back, I guess the fundamental difference is what you mean by inference, right? There's a sense in which LLMs and current deep learning networks are engaging in inference. I mean, essentially what you're doing when you're querying one of these models is creating a conditional probability distribution, right? So like you have your model, and then you're saying, well, I have this data, so conditioned on this data. So the model's output is in some sense like a big conditioning process. And there's a sense in which, well, because this kind of process conforms to the rules of Bayesian probability or whatever, you can think of it as a form of inference. All that is good. And I wouldn't want to say that these systems don't engage in inference, because they do in that sense. Like the computations that they perform, respect the laws of probability theory, Bayes, and all that. Therefore, it's fine. But in the active inference literature, when we talk about inference, what we have in mind is changing your mind in light of new information in real time, right? Which is markedly different. So on our definition, systems like, ChatGPT were engaged in inference during their training, and then they're dead on arrival, right? Because that's the point at which they're in contact with the world generating data, right? So you train these things, it takes 3 months, it costs you $100 million, 70% of which is like, electricity bills. And then it's dead on arrival. Like that, to us, that's not like genuine intelligence. I mean, it's a kind of glorified database or lookup table, which again, I don't want to knock these technologies. Deep learning is a huge advance. And just like 10, 15 years ago, like this was like the absolute pioneering bleeding edge of what was going on. And I'm sure these technologies have a future to a certain extent. But it's just what you need if your aim is to do things like drone control and real-time robotics. Like what you need is to be able to have a system that has a perspective on the world and is able to change that perspective, update its beliefs in real time based on the information that it's generating continuously, right? That's really the end goal in some sense. You're not going to get that with systems that, like I said, take months to train. But then to train here means to do it one pass of inference where you're updating your whole model based on your data set, right? Yeah, so we're trying to, in summary, draw upon the billions of natural R&D the universe consists in some sense, right? Natural experiment to design more efficient AI systems. There's a lot of talk about how the next AI revolution might need something like new power sources or something. We need to develop nuclear fusion or whatever to be able to. I mean, it doesn't seem like many people have considered that. Hey, maybe these, the brain runs on a banana and a glass of water, right? Like, I don't need a nuclear fusion power plant running my brain. Like, it runs on 20 watts, right? So
Yeah.
if you need if you literally need to build new power plants, you're probably doing something wrong, right? Like, and so. But there is another approach, and it is to learn from nature and do things parsimoniously. Another way to think about what we're doing is that we're moving from big data to, I hesitate to say smart data. I guess frugal data might be more appropriate. One of the things that we'll be demonstrating actually is the vastly improved sample efficiency of our system. So we don't need big data to train our systems because we deploy systems that are intelligent about how they use data. So you seek out informative stimuli and you update your beliefs, right? And that's really the key. Like in some sense, it's sort of like the scientific method extended to AI itself. It's like we're building little systems that have a hypothesis about the way the world is, and then just need to be perturbed a little bit and test the hypothesis against incoming data. And that's really the loop. I have some idea, some belief about how the world is, and then necessarily, because the map must be simpler than the territory, I'm going to encounter some there's going to be some resistance, there's going to be some divergence, right? And then you update your map. And when I say this is a feature, the map is necessary. I'm saying this is a feature. The map is necessarily simpler than the territory, right? So you say you're based in the UK. How useless would a 1-to-1 scale map of London be? Imagine trying to look something just imagine the paper that it would need, right? So the map has to be simpler than the territory to be useful. And so if you have a simplified map of the territory, then what you can do is use the divergence as the signal to then make decisions, decide what's going on, and to plan and route yourself through London, right?
I like so there's so many interesting things there, but on that point of pointing to the sort of immense efficiency of humans, the fact that they're kind of quick inference, right? So it's almost there's information out there already in our natural environment, and it's just the ability to extract sort of the right information at the right time. I was talking to a researcher from Michael Levin's lab and Al Hazan. Yeah, and we were talking about on your point of maybe we'll run out of literally the ability to produce electricity and transistors because if the models we need to make are just so enormous, then that is the bottleneck, and that makes me think that the more AI progresses, the more it has to be almost. In that podcast that I just mentioned, we talked about we have to make computation and and AI more like humans, and we need to like try and learn from like how cells actually fire, how neurons fire, because again, like how can we unlock that efficiency and like that natural ability to be parsimonious? And so it's like AI kind of more and more must sort of look a bit like us to have the kind of capacities that we might want them to have.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no sense reinventing the wheel, right? Like we want to build intelligent machines. Well, every time a baby is born, an intelligent machine has been created, in fact. So, why not just borrow from nature, right? Like that, it seems like a very parsimonious way to approach this. And it's probably the only sustainable way to do it, frankly. Whenever some new technological revolution, the slogan is we're going to need new energy sources to power this. Yeah, it's probably not a path to sustainable development, right? Like, so I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, on this point of sustainability of producing AI, I'm wondering what you think of. So I was thinking about how say large language models are trained. Like a lot of it is by the internet, but I was thinking in a way the internet is kind of just like one enormous database, but we only have one of it. The thing is the thing, and so if you train on that, you can train on the whole thing as much as you can. That is actually useful. But once you've done that, it's like, what more is there to kind of do? You've kind of like you know that there are ways you can like get humans to interact with it and train it, but that's slow, and it's it's not, again, it's as you say, these large language models are doing inference, but like they're doing it again and again, but then once you actually have them, then they're no longer doing that inference. So the training kind of is all before, but we think about us, we can learn kind of instantaneously and then sort of try new behavior.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with all that. Not sure what to add.
Okay,
I think, yeah,
well, I'm glad. Yeah, I'm glad you say that. Like, because one thing I was listening to. You may not know him, but Jonathan Pajot was talking about. Once these large language models start like producing their own new content and things, like now the internet will be filled with more of what they have produced. So it's a kind of regurgitation. Like we got the internet, but it's only one data source. Now you start producing more, but it's like, where does new real live information about the world come from with them? So
exactly. So what's gonna the future of AI is IA, right? The future of artificial intelligence is intelligent agents, right? And that's ultimately where I think the relevant data is going to come from. It's going to come from the real world, right? Like ultimately the internet is sort of like history, right? Like it's a repository of all of our knowledge and everything, but what we would want is to create systems that are able to assess situations in real time and act within them in a way that conforms to our highest ethical standards, our the general regulation that conforms to like laws and customs and so to create agents that have some sense of what is contextually appropriate, and then who act in contextually appropriate ways in real time based on the data that they generate through their actions, in effect. So I agree that that sort of speaks to like this idea of the spatial web that we're developing. So the Versus has a nonprofit sister organization called the Spatial Web Foundation, and part of what we have done as a kind of tandem is to create a standardized world modeling language that we are gifting to the IEEE. If everything goes well, it should be publicly available this year. So it's called Hyperspace Modeling Language, and it is. I mean, this is part of the general push towards an ecosystem of intelligences, right? Like, so, what would you need to create like a kind of patchwork of specialized agents? Well, one thing that you would need is a kind of standardized set of tools to design agents in a way that you might have a repository, for example, of different agent types that are already appropriate to act in a given kind of setting, right? So this kind of you know, the metaverse you might think like of as, you know, the virtual reality and something, but there's this notion, especially in the East, of the physical metaverse, which is more like a blurring of the lines between physical reality and the digital world, uh, where in some sense, like our kind of representation of reality in a world model becomes part of the control loop itself, right? So, I mean, it's very ambitious sounding and everything, but the hope is to kind of move towards like doing for infrastructure and just technology generally what nervous systems do for organisms and their bodies, right? To kind of create this kind of backbone of coordination, allowing, you know, specialized systems to be deployed in specialized circumstances in an appropriate way. You know, the brain works like this, right? Like, so I really like Michael Anderson's work. He's got a great book, Beyond Phrenology, where he proposes that essentially the way the brain works is that the brain areas are computationally specialized, not functionally specialized. I mean, there's very interesting. He does some meta analyses and draws on some very recent, you know, neuroimaging work and everything to show that, well, you know, even areas that we think of as functionally specialized aren't really so. So one of the things he points out, for example, is the Broca's area, that famous area that's supposedly responsible for the production of speech. It's involved in more non-speech tasks than in speech-related tasks. So what that tells you is each bit of the brain is actually specialized to take like a configuration in and to spit out a modified configuration. So they're computationally specialized modules. And what the brain is doing in real time on Anderson's account, which I think is a very compelling account, is to assemble transient ensembles, transient neural assemblies that basically on the fly pick out which contributions need to be brought to bear to solve the problem in real time, right? So, you know, like you're listening to someone, then you're going to recruit like the parts of the brain that you need to shuffle that pattern into the appropriate kind of pattern and then produce the appropriate response. So we're basically trying to do to AI what, you know, brains do in some sense to the kind of compositional modular structure. And kind of just take this strategy but write it large, right? To say, well, you know, there are certain agent types that you might deploy, like drone agents, camera agents, car agents, whatever. And then, you know, you can like kind of tune them as specifically as you want to the specific context in which they're going to be needed and deployed ultimately. So you can think of this kind of build a brain, if you'll.
Yeah, I really like you bringing that in, that that brain areas are that, well, that they're kind of, it's more specialized in ways of doing computation, because it kind of again points to, we were talking at the start about everything being a kind of collective intelligence. And the more, like, I was listening to Michael Evan recently talking about like, even if you're using like, you know, very simple, like, you know, agents of like literally like small code blocks, the more and more agents you have, up to a point, there's like a critical point where the more and more you have, like, they almost, each of them can give their own, like, you know, ideas, their own perspective. And so it's like, if you just have enough things, you know, they can search an enormous search space almost. So
Yeah, correct.
you know, so it's,
And, you know, human intelligence is a lot like this. Sperber and Mercier are two cognitive anthropologists that I like a lot. And they put out a book called The Enigma of Reason, which you may have heard of. And their whole argument, I mean, they make a bunch of very interesting contributions in that book. But one of the interesting things that they point out is that we think of confirmation bias as a kind of mistake, right? Like it's a kind of mistaken heuristic. But provided that we have instruments and tools to exchange reasons amongst ourselves, right? Confirmation bias is the optimal search strategy. It's much easier, especially if the brain operates like active inference suggests, right? Where you have a belief and then there's a divergence, and, you know, what you're trying to do is to, in some sense, change your mind as little as possible given the new information that you're receiving. You're trying to be parsimonious about the way that your information, the information that you're getting is changing your beliefs. Well, it's most efficient if everyone is very kind of strong-minded about their beliefs and looks for evidence to the effect that they're right. so long as others can say, hey, actually, you're wrong about this and consider this evidence. So they propose like my side bias as a better way of understanding the phenomenon of confirmation bias, which is to say, yeah, I'm going to be biased towards my own beliefs, but provided that we are a community and that we have like, the appropriate communication protocols and channels, then that actually turns out to be an optimal search strategy. And yeah, you can think of like collective intelligence more broadly as that. The immune system is another great example of that, where you have like these cells that are essentially are kind of like a register for, okay, we'll produce this kind of antigen in this kind of context and everything. It's all about like, activating the right cells and getting those populations to effectively clone themselves in order to like generate an appropriate immune response. So, what in some sense, what we're trying to do is to build this out, like move from like explanatory principles to like genuine design principles for artificially intelligent systems.
Interesting. I was gonna even bring up the enigma of reason. That the fact that we actually should be biased in our reasoning. Because if individually we all are, then collectively we're more likely to get to the right result. And even relatedly, I was reading a paper on bacteria and how it seems that like looking at like the species of bacteria is actually kind of irrelevant. So again, it doesn't matter like what it is. Just like in a brain region, we actually shouldn't split up as like where it's more actually like they almost fill functional roles. The different, so it doesn't matter what species they are, and actually it's in some ways more useful to think about, you could say, the kind of computations, the kind of thing that they're doing in that collective. And as long as like everyone fills certain things, then overall, like the way I was understanding it is that even bacteria, they have kind of niches, and so like they almost work like a little ecosystem, and they can all help each other survive. And it's just someone needs to fill one role, and someone needs to fill the other.
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, on the active inference view, what you have at the end of the day is like this nesting of agent environment relationships. So like in some sense, my body is an environment for the organ systems that make me up, right? And in turn, each of these organ systems is an environment for, the individual organs that compose it. And so on and so on, right? Organs are an environment to the relevant cell types, and cells are an environment to the relevant organelles and nuclei and all of this stuff, and so on and so forth, all the way down. Like you can really think of like you can think of biological self-organization as a kind of stack of environment organism relationships, like so echoing like ecological psychology and this kind of stuff, but maybe stretching some of the concepts to the breaking point. Like I have had disagreements with eco-psych people. It seems like they want, affordances to pick out one specific layer of the stack, which is like the organismal, that of the organism. I kind of feel like it might be more fruitful to just blow that up and to think of the affordances that are available to cells, the affordances that are available to organ systems, and so on. So you really have like this genuinely multi-scale ecological kind of approach that opens up with active inference that I find quite exciting.
Yeah, fascinating. So we've talked about collective intelligences, AI, and the future. So maybe another, easy and simple topic would be consciousness.
Right, just just easy.
Yeah, just another classic topic. No, I mean, yeah, it's and I guess the reason why I want to bring that up now especially is because we talked a lot about things needing to be agents, or not. I mean, that's kind of an open thing. Just the way it seems is that maybe like again you had a paper on active inference kind of needs to be named inactive inference. It's so much of it is about, like, as you say, sampling the world and doing things, and so maybe one way to start is how should we think of consciousness in light of active inference and the free energy principle, and maybe even what it says about AI. And
that's a great set of questions. So I think it was debated amongst us in the FEP literature whether the FEP really had anything unique to say about consciousness. I guess like at one end of the question, we've proposed, and when I say we, it's folks like Anil Seth and myself and our co-authors, Antoine Lutz and a few others, we proposed a few years ago this project of computational phenomenology. So this is a kind of it's deploying the free energy principle in active inference as a modeling methodology for a new kind of data, which is phenomenological data. So, like, okay, just roughly speaking, the context of discovery for active inference, the free energy principle, and so on, is generative modeling in neurophysiology. So a generative model is a model of the process that generates the data that we're interested in. So originally, these techniques were first developed in the context of neurophysiology, neuroimaging, where the data that we're interested in is indirect or direct measurements of brain activity, usually indirect. So if you're talking about fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging works basically by detecting the magnetically active byproducts of oxygen use by neurons. So the neurons use oxygen when they burn ATP and all that stuff. And about 5 to 6 seconds after that activity, there's a temporal lag. But with very high spatial precision, you're able to say, okay, oxygen was used here because you got this. So it's the signal that you pick up is called the BOLD signal, blood oxygenation level dependent signal. And then, so what you use generative models for in that framework is to say, okay, well, what is the most probable set of underlying neurophysiological responses that would have elicited that BOLD signal? And in that context, well, you have a bunch of different models that represent what the underlying physiological activity might be, and you use free energy minimization, right? You say, well, the model that's the most probable is the model with the least free energy. So I have, the data that I picked up, and then a bunch of models saying, well, if this was the activity, then you would get that data, and you end up picking the right model by picking the one with the lowest free energy. Active inference is the same idea, but now the data that I'm trying to explain isn't data that I'm generating using a big magnet thing. It's the data that my eyes, my ears, my skin, all of my sensory organs are generating. And then the model isn't a model of the underlying neurophysiological activity that caused the data that I'm picking up. It's a model of me acting in the environment, right? But it's the same idea, right? Like, I think I'm acting in this or that way. I think I'm walking in a straight line on a street, and then there's a divergence, and then I realize that, I slipped and I fell or whatever, right? Like, so it's the same idea. Like, you have a generative model, a model of the process that generated my data. It's just the data type has changed. So generative modeling is agnostic to the data type that you're interested in. Computational phenomenology is the idea that we can basically generate descriptions of first-person experience using phenomenological or other qualitative first-person methods, and then write down a generative model of that phenomenology. So kind of, and then there's a kind of two-step process where once you've written down a model of that phenomenology, well, that constrains the space of possible models that might, be related to the brain processes underlying that. So that's one whole project. It doesn't say anything about whether consciousness itself conforms to the free energy principle. It's just saying, well, and maybe taking one step back for the purposes of the audience, because we've been talking about the free energy principle without really defining it. So the free energy principle is a principle of information physics, and it basically says if I exist in the physical universe, in the sense that I can be reliably re-identified as the same thing over time by an external observer, then it'll look as if that thing is tracking the things that it's coupled to. Another way of thinking about it is that the FEP is a principle of information physics applied to coupled random dynamical systems, and it says that random dynamical systems that are coupled will appear to track each other by virtue of the fact that they're coupled but separate. Right? So sort of like if you were talking about one thing, then it would all kind of blur and diffuse, like cream in a coffee, right? But since you're talking about two separate things, the best you can do is that they begin to resemble each other. You don't get like one kind of like, light brown colored coffee, you get like two kind of things that couple to each other. So yeah, and so the free energy principle says if you exist in the physical universe, then you're going to look as if you infer what you're coupled to. And clearly, in some sense, systems that are conscious are things, and therefore they should be modelable using the free energy principle. So then you're not making any strong kind of commitments about what kind of thing consciousness is, and the free energy principle isn't necessarily illuminating like the deep nature of consciousness when you're doing this. It's really like, okay, this is a general modeling framework and it can apply to anything. Clearly my experience is such a thing, and therefore we apply.
Am I right? Go on.
No, you go.
Well, I just want to say, am I right? So then in saying that, yeah, the free energy principle, like it's one framework to apply to something like cognition, but like inherently doesn't say anything like something has to be cognition or whatever. It's like, it's about like, yeah, objects in the world. And so it's
about things.
Right.
You can think about it as a mathematical approach to thingness per se. So, and it's been mischaracterized by myself in the past, for example, as a theory of organisms and livingness. It can be used as the basis for such a theory, but intrinsically, it's even broader than that. It's a theory of thingness. If you're a thing in the physical universe, in the sense that you don't just dissolve into your environment, then you necessarily will conform to this principle. Like it's going to look as if you're tracking what you're coupled. Okay. So the key construct behind the free energy principle is this idea of a Markov blanket, which you may have heard of. And so, yeah, the Markov blanket is essentially the interface between something and what it is not. So, I mean, in some sense, you can think of the Markov blanket as all of the degrees of freedom that couple two systems together and that separate those systems. So the set of degrees of freedom that separate and couple two systems. So we were talking about computational phenomenology. Given the Markov blanket, I can talk about the opposite extreme view, which I think can coexist, but it depends on what your interest is. Like if you want to say something about consciousness per se, or if you want to just model interesting kinds of experience in a kind of like neurophenomenology style. So the Markov blanket, in some sense, is where all of the information that describes the coupling between two systems lives, right? So if two things are coupled, everything that you need to describe that coupling by definition lives on the blanket. It's where all of the classical information that describes the coupling lives. So the hypothesis that was put forward a few years ago by Chris Fields, Jim Glazebrook, and Mike Levin in a great paper, I think it's called Minimal Physicalism or something like that. They proposed the inner screen hypothesis, which is to say that, if classical information must live on the blanket, then maybe consciousness is related to the existence of an inner blanket. Or, in other words, consciousness requires internal boundaries, right? So we have this. We've elaborated this in a whole paper, which is pre-printed and currently under revision. The idea there is that consciousness corresponds to the existence of this kind of irreducible internal screen, where the system that you're considering is kind of partitioned in such a way that, like, some of the information that's relevant to its actions lives on a kind of inner screen. And you can kind of see this as a naturalization of the homunculus, maybe provocatively. So we've been going around calling this like neo-Cartesianism. We do avoid the kind of infinite regress, because the idea there is that the inner screen does not observe itself. The most it can do is observe subordinate screens. When you think about like the cortical hierarchy, we usually focus on each layer and say, well, this layer is connected to this layer is connected to this layer. The perspective from the free energy principle says, don't focus on the layers, focus on their interface. The same structure is actually just a series of screens between the layers, And what the screens do, in effect, is coarse grain the subordinate screen, right? So, like, you have at the sensory end, you have, screens that kind of encode all of the information coming up, welling up from the sensory ends. And then as you ascend the cortical hierarchy, what each successive screen is doing is basically coarse graining. So kind of removing the excess kind of information and saying, well, all of these things are basically this. And, there is at the top and at the bottom 2 screens that are write only in some sense, right? The sensory end can only push things in, and at the very top, it can only write down, right? And that's really the key, we think, to like the reflexive aspect of self-consciousness. Like, there exists an irreducible layer that in some sense can only infer itself into existence. It doesn't have direct access to itself. It has to infer that it exists through its effect on the other layers, and ultimately the bottom layer being the sensory motor interface itself, its effects on the world. So there is something a bit more robust that you can say about consciousness based on the free energy principle. It's very speculative right now. Like, we're in the very, very early days of modeling this, but we'll be moving into a more kind of experimental setting and actually like testing out these hypotheses over the next few years.
Interesting. To see if I understand it, I mean, that this inner kind of, is it basically people kind of before they would be like the kids, obviously there is a boundary by which things interact. That's the point of the free energy principle, but no one sort of thought about, wait, what is going sort of on more inside of that thing doing that interaction. And yeah, it's the way it does sound a little Cartesian, but it's like not necessarily, or like it has to be something looking at a screen, but more, is it the screen?
To be honest, like, Descartes is one of the most like misunderstood philosophers like ever. Honestly, I don't think depending on the time in history that you're considering, Descartes is everyone's favorite like person to use as a foil, right? So in the 18th century, Descartes was criticized for inventing physicalism and the soulless clockwork universe, right? More recently, like in the 20th century, Descartes gets beaten up because he's the inventor of dualism and brings like the mysterious soul back into where, so depending on the period, Descartes is accused of a bunch of stuff when he's actually like struggling with some pretty core questions. And you have folks like Merleau-Ponty, who everyone loves, but who took Descartes very seriously. You may know this. Merleau-Ponty died from a stroke reading Descartes while he was reading Le Monde.
Didn't know.
Yeah, he died on his desk, like reading Descartes, which is
it's I mean, but it's interesting. I think John Vervaeke has also talked about like we kind of misunderstand Descartes, and he had like loads of great things, and I think we should think about that a lot. Well, I should, because it's easy to be like, you hear other people criticizing philosophers, and obviously we want to make progress, and it's necessary to think about ways in which someone might be wrong, but like you also have to appreciate like how amazing a thinker they would be. That's why we're talking about them, and maybe you should think about.
I don't think philosophy makes progress. That's not how philosophy works.
So it's like it's in this theory of consciousness. Then I've kind of heard you talk a little bit about it before. Like ultimately, sometimes I wonder, like, and I'm guilty of this too. We kind of maybe sensationalize consciousness, like we don't even want to think it's something that can be understood because it's so interesting. How could it just be reduced to things? So there's also a part of you which goes like, there's no theory of consciousness I'd ever accept, and that can be problematic. So, but yeah, is it an answerable question to think about, like, though even like, things have their own inner Markov blanket as well, and this could be fundamental to consciousness. But I'm interested in like, why do we feel like we have a unified consciousness then, and is there a way of going about explaining that and our experience?
I think that's precisely what the inner screen model in large part explains, right? Because if you're considering each layer of the brain as like coarse graining the following, you reach a layer where no more coarse graining is possible. So there is a topmost layer, and this doesn't have to be like a pyramid, right? It may be that like 80% of the brain subserves that kind of top layer, But yeah, I mean, I would think that this kind of the structure of the flow of information throughout the brain kind of imposes this kind of centripetal kind of. But on the flip side, though, I think one of the great lessons of say psychoanalysis and the phenomenology that is closer to psychoanalysis. So like I'm thinking of Ricoeur and people like that. I think it was Merleau-Ponty who said you can recapture all of the core Freudian insights by abandoning the intuition that consciousness is at all times unified. And when I think about my own consciousness, like I'm a little bit ADHD brain, and like I don't feel like my consciousness is unified into one flow all the time. Certainly, maybe
Yeah.
that's my own pathology, but yeah, I think it's a very it's probably not the most fruitful way to think about consciousness as like continuously unified. Um, I mean, the self might be something like that, but then I would recommend looking at the work of say Anil Seth to kind of get some insight into why the self might be a stable thing. Although I
Yeah.
think that given the time that we have remaining, that's probably too big a topic.
Yeah, I even point people to John Vervaeke and some of his colleagues had a series called The Elusive I, which is like even if even like Carl Jung talked about, like there's an ego which is a bit elusive and only one part of a bigger self, but there is a way in which, like through narratives, through over time, for our connections with others, there are these things which bind all the different parts together. And on like a final thing is that you talk about sometimes you don't feel like you're necessarily unified, and Freud definitely would say there are different parts of us. And there's some great work by people like Damien Kelty Stevens talking about like the multifractality of sometimes things bind together, and there are these flow like nature to our movements, where like we suddenly have these like critical moments of coordination and everything comes together. But there are also like at all times, you could say, like small brain processes, small movements like going in other directions, and that's how, and we can sometimes stop them, but then sometimes we let them happen. And so there is a kind of flowy nature where we are letting, as we've been talking about, you could say smaller subsystems, smaller computational levels that are allowed to do their own thing, see different possibilities, see different and even embodied more active possibilities, and then there are
you
sometimes.
familiar with Francisco Varela and his work?
No, I don't think so.
So Varela has this great little collection on ethics, actually, where he talks about like micro selves. So like the self is basically like a pastiche of micro selves that are like appropriate to certain contexts. Yeah, and again, I think we overemphasize the degree to which we're like integrated and unified. That might be like a kind of hangover from Enlightenment philosophy. Like a kind of it's basically a through line running from Descartes to Hegel. Effectively, this kind of unified self idea. I think the Freudian revolution / the cognitive revolution kind of undermine that premise really significantly. It's which brings us back, I think, appropriately to the beginning, right? Like intelligence is collective intelligence, and I think even if our sense of self is unified and one, that doesn't mean that unification and oneness doesn't emerge from a kind of patchwork or meshwork of different selves interacting. So all of these things can be true. We can have our cake and eat it too. I think.
Thank you. This has been great. So where can people find your work, and do you have anything more you want to say?
You can follow our developments at verses.ai. I'm quite active on X/Twitter, which is where I think we met. So yeah, I basically post everything there. And yeah, we will be regularly posting our updates. Like I said, on verses.ai, there's a whole R&D subsection. I'd recommend following our blog. We more increasingly regularly, we'll be putting out short pieces, kind of explaining to an informed lay audience what we're doing. And you'll have, that's probably the easiest way to keep track of what we're doing. Let me just express gratitude for the invitation. This has been a really fun conversation, and hope you have a great one.
Yeah, I learned those too. So thank you. Awesome.
Fantastic.